Today is the 42nd day after Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022. What happened? Why does it matter? What's the context of this conflict? And why do Ukrainians resist? There are kind of four kind of large questions.
He's a teacher. He's an expert from UAB. He's been over there monitoring elections.
And so, and in terms of what these four kind of topics, I'd like to kind of explain what happened and what's happening now. So on February the 24th, 2022, Russia launched a, quote, limited military operation. Russia has never called this a war or an invasion. It launched this limited military operation against its neighbor, claiming that it wanted to protect the men, women, and children living in the two Russian-controlled provinces of Donetsk.
George, excuse me, your slides are not advancing. You'll need to click on them.
I'm sorry, I see my slides. My slides are here. Do you see my slides?
We're still.
Yeah, click on the second slide.
This one?
Third slide.
Click on number 2 and it'll show up big.
This is number 2.
Number 2 says what happened,
Right.
why it matters, what is the context.
Right.
But we're not seeing it big, we're just seeing it little.
We're seeing it little.
It's a little list of slides on the left. If you can do a page down and see what happens.
I can't advance your slides.
No, we can't, but he can.
Okay, and I'm doing it through, okay, let me, okay. This is the title page, right?
Right.
Yeah, we're seeing the title page.
Okay, this is the next one. Do you see this one?
No,
No. What
it's not
happened?
showing up big.
It's not advancing.
Well, it's advancing on mine.
I think you need to swap screens so that your shared screen is different from the presenter screen.
It is. I'm not sure what to do now. I'm sorry. Maybe I should just get out of this and start again.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would be
Let
good.
me,
Close it.
let me try to do an escape. Okay. So on this one, do you see
Okay.
There we go.
you got it.
this?
There.
Yeah,
It advances.
right.
Okay. You see the map now.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, well, this is kind of with on the left-hand side, you'll see this, I think, and then on this side, you'll see this.
Correct.
Right.
Okay, this is the only way that I can think of kind of advancing the screen so that you can see it.
That's fine.
Okay. Okay. So, so what happened here? On February the 24th, Russia launched a limited military operation, or so-called, against Ukraine, claiming that it sought to protect the men, women, and children living in the two Russian-controlled areas of the Donbass and the Luhansk provinces. And the Russian authorities claimed that they were preventing this local population under Russian control from experiencing genocide from the Ukrainians. Initially, when this invasion started, there was confusion, enormous confusion among Western analysts and even among the Russian public as to what Mr. Putin's final objective was. Whether it was just this territory in eastern Ukraine, or was it something larger? but increasingly, as the days have turned into weeks, and as the weeks have turned into the first full month, and now 6 weeks after the invasion, it becomes increasingly clear that Mr. Putin's immediate objective is to destroy Ukraine and to annihilate its citizens, especially those who were supporting Ukrainian independence. So far, according to this map released by this Institute of War, and if you kind of Google Institute of War, it's a Washington, D.C. based research center concerned with military affairs, and every day they provide a new updated map as to what's happened in Ukraine. And this is the most recent map that I had access to. And as you can see, despite the great predictions, including by Pentagon planners after Russia invaded, that the Ukrainian government would only last for 72 hours, 90 or to maybe even 96 hours. This conflict has now kind of lasted for well over 6 weeks. And in terms of this 6 weeks, the Russian military has made limited advances into Ukraine. And as you can see from the points in red here, that Russia has not succeeded in toppling the Ukrainian government, and has, in the process of invading Ukraine, encountered enormous resistance, not just from the Ukrainian military, but from the civilian population as well. So do you see this one? Why does this war matter?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so why does this war matter? This war matters because the largest country in the world, in terms of territorial space, that is Russia, has invaded the largest country wholly within Europe, and that's Ukraine. And in so doing, it has violated internationally recognized boundaries, borders. This war matters because increasingly it may involve NATO, because there are 4 NATO countries bordering Ukraine, that is Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. They border Ukraine. And if Russian troops were to cross the Ukrainian NATO borders, apparently, according to NATO doctrine, according to Article 6, NATO would be forced to respond, whatever that means. This war also matters because it has generated a horrific humanitarian crisis, which you see every day on your television screens. This humanitarian crisis is not just outside of the borders of Ukraine, in which over 4.5 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine, but also within Ukraine itself, in which there are 6 million internal refugees as well. And this refugee crisis, this humanitarian crisis, keeps metasizing every day, by the hour. And of course, this war matters because it affects everyone. No one is across the world is immune from the consequences, the economic and the political consequences, if not the political consequences of this war. I mean, we've had inflation over the past few months due to kind of the various problems with COVID. But now, as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are higher prices in terms of oil, natural gas, and food, and not just for the wealthier countries of the world, such as Europe and United States, but also, and more horribly, for the poorer countries in Africa and in the Middle East, which means that the political stability in those regions affected by this food crisis, the political stability of these areas might be upended. So, how did this? So, what's the big picture? How did this problem start? What's kind of the background behind this war? Well, if you see this map of the countries that were created by the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, you can see that if at one point up to in 1991, there was one country, that is the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. By the end of 1991, there were now 15 independent countries emerged from the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And this collapse of the Soviet Union, which occurred in December of 1991, was the most peaceful disintegration of any empire in the history of the world. But just because it was peaceful in 1991, it has no longer been peaceful since that time, as we will discuss. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it created 15 newly independent countries. Russia in the center there, the largest country in the world, emerged, as did Ukraine over here. So if you look at a map of Europe, and most people seem nowadays totally unacquainted with maps, including most of my students, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe by territory. Of course, Russia is larger, but Russia is not just in Europe, but much of Russia is also in Asia, or the majority of Russia is in Asia as well. So Russia is a bicontinental country, whereas Ukraine is totally within the boundaries of Europe. So as you can see from this map, Ukraine is large. And of course, all of these countries in Europe are much smaller than the United States. But even if you were to take a map of Ukraine, and this is a map of Ukraine in pink, you can see the map, right?
Yes.
Okay, the map of Ukraine, and you can see Chicago on it, New York, and you can see the distances here. And the distances are quite vast from north to south and from east to west. So when Ukraine becomes independent in 1991, it now occupies a very strategic geopolitical position on the map of the world. It is the largest single country totally within Europe at 233,000 square miles. It is slightly less than the size of Texas, but 4 times the size of Georgia. So even by US standards, it is a large piece of real estate. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, it possessed the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world after the United States and Russia. And beginning in 1994 onwards, Ukraine became involved in various negotiations with the United States and Russia. And by 1996, Ukraine completely surrendered its nuclear arms under the terms of the Budapest Agreement, signed in 1994. And at this Budapest agreement, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia pledged to guarantee to respect the independence, the sovereignty, and the existing borders of Ukraine. Well, in addition to these two factors, Ukraine is also a very large agricultural and manufacturing producer. It occupies a very important part of the world economy, especially in less developed countries in Africa and Central and Asia and Greater Asia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, every one of these 15 newly independent countries began to kind of experiment with various political and economic forms. And over the past 30 years, Ukraine as well as Russia started on the same trajectory, but then by fits and starts, they diverged. And in terms of this 30-year experiment, Ukraine experienced two major developments. First of all, it experienced a pluralism by default, so to speak, as some of my esteemed colleagues in political science call this, in which no one ruler of Ukraine could take control of all of the natural resources or the economic resources or the political resources or the military resources of Ukraine. So there was a kind of a diversity of political power, a decentralized control with many centers of power, many regional centers of power within Ukraine. And at the same time, Ukraine, and this plays into this pluralism by default, at the same time, Ukraine nourished a very strong mobilized civil society. That is, groups outside of the control of the government or outside of kind of the business sector, which played an important role in civil society, in how society operates. And all sorts of political and educational groups and nonprofits developed, which were completely independent of the government and of many of Ukraine's richest men and women. Well, in this 30-year span, as Ukraine develops this pluralism by default and a strong mobilized society, Russia did not. And when Mr. Putin comes to power in Russia in the year 2000, he begins to accumulate power and begins the dismantling of Russian civil society, which he has successfully completed by the end of 2021. So Ukraine also in this period of the 1990s especially, and even after the 1990s, experienced a serious number of entrenched problems, as did all of these kind of post-Soviet countries that emerged independent of the Soviet Union in 1991. That is, Ukraine experienced an absence of a revolutionary break after 1991, especially in the economic and political spheres. That is, despite the fact that the new political leaders of Ukraine all aspired to kind of the freedoms and the economic progress of the European Economic Community or that of the United States, they did not exactly understand how to create a democratic, open market society from the remnants, from the from the remnants of 70 years of communism. No one did. It was an experiment for everyone involved, including those countries closer to Western Europe, such as Poland as well. Ukraine also, in this period of the 1990s, experienced enormous, a very high inflation rate, and its economy collapsed. And Ukraine also possessed a large number of social, national, and regional divisions, in many respects, a complete polarization of Ukrainian society between those who wanted to move closer to, say, what becomes the European Union, and those that sought kind of to live in the shadow of Russia. So at the beginning of the 21st century, Ukraine found itself as the largest country in Europe between an expanded European Union and NATO in the West and Russia in the East. Increasingly, more and more Ukrainians wanted to join the European Union to become, quote unquote, a normal country like Poland. And many Ukrainians living right next to Poland had visited Poland and were shocked and amazed at how quickly Poland had adapted to democracy and to an open market system. At this point in time, at the beginning of the 21st century, only a very small percentage of the citizens of Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Instead, many of them put their hopes in the European Union. And so Ukraine's political neighborhood, its neighbors to the west were changing. That is, Ukraine's neighbors to the west, which had been communist countries up to 1989, were changing, but Ukraine's politics were not changing at all. And so you see this map of the European Union, okay, green map.
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm sorry, I should hit one button here that works that I know. Okay, so this is the map of the European Union. This is the most recent map I could steal from the internet. Unfortunately, I cannot, I believe this is the most up-to-date map of the European Union. You can see that Great Britain, which has exited the European Union, is no longer in green. But here is Ukraine right here, bordering Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, countries which are both members of the European Union and NATO as well. And this is a picture of a map of NATO expansion since this time. Since this map was created, and I included this map because this is a colorful map. I enjoy colorful maps because they provide clearer information than kind of more detailed maps. But this map does not include two new members of NATO, that is Montenegro, which became a member in 2017, and that is Northern Macedonia, that is north of Greece, which became a member in 2019. So Ukraine's Western neighbors have joined the European Union and NATO, and as a consequence, now a number of decisions need to be taken politically. And in terms of these political decisions at the beginning of the 21st century, after NATO expansion and the expansion of the European Union to Ukraine's borders, two major crises occur about 10 years apart. That is the Orange Revolution of November to December 2004, and the Euromaidan Revolution of November 2013 to February of 2014. Both of these revolutions are very much interconnected. They included more or less the same players. These revolutions contained rigged elections, contested decisions by the government on the one hand and by the masses on the other, but they were also connected by this relationship which developed between a man called Viktor Yanukovych, whom I'll explain in a few moments, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Viktor Yanukovych was a pro-Russian political leader in Ukraine. He was the governor of Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine, easternmost region of Ukraine. He became governor in 1997 until 2002. Then he was appointed the prime minister of Ukraine from 2002 to 2004. He was again appointed prime minister in 2006 to 2007. And finally, he won fairly and democratically. And I was at these elections in January and February of 2010. He won the presidency of Ukraine in February of 2010. Well, when he became president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was, let us say, closely allied with President Putin of Russia, he began to introduce more authoritarian policies than his predecessors. He created a supermajority within Ukraine's parliament. He introduced many unconstitutional measures, and he supported many pro-Russian initiatives. By the end of his rule in 2013, there were no checks and balances placed on him. He had now smashed all institutional restraints, and Ukraine's pluralism and civil society were now in serious danger. Ukraine's hybrid democracy now was on the verge of becoming a full-blown dictatorship. And so in November of 2013 into February of 2014, there were mass protests on the streets of Kiev and other major Ukrainian cities. And finally, in February of 2014, he fled Ukraine and found safety in Putin's Russia. Well, we talked about Yanukovych, but as you might guess, President Putin, who had put a lot of effort in bringing Ukraine back into the Russian fold since the beginning of the 21st century, President Putin was not a very happy camper about the events of 2014. Ukrainians increasingly had become, over the last decade, a serious problem for him. His preferred candidate in the 2004 presidential elections, this Viktor Yanukovych I spoke about, did not become president despite all of President Putin's efforts to put him into the presidency. But even when President Putin was successful in 2010 of putting Mr. Yanukovych into power, Yanukovych was removed by popular protests in 2014. And this was all a major setback for Putin's goals. And Putin's goals by 2014 were quite evident. That is, he sought to ensure that all international decisions be taken only with Russian participation. He wanted to prevent any more enlargements of NATO or the European Union to include former Soviet countries such as Ukraine. He hoped to contain and to push back Western pro-democracy efforts in Russia, as well as in these post-Soviet states. And he hoped, of course, to minimize the possibility of regime change, not just in Russia, but all across these post-Soviet states, which increasingly became loyal to Russia. And so Putin, as this cartoon demonstrates, became threatened by Ukraine. And in terms of his perception of Ukraine's threat to Russia after the removal of President Yanukovych in 2014, President Putin then sends Russian troops to the Crimea, which was a part of Ukraine and still is internationally recognized as a constituent part of Ukraine. Russian troops occupied the Crimea, and the Russian government and the Russian parliament formally annexed Crimea 3 weeks later. At the same time, President Putin stoked up pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. A number of them began to storm government buildings in eastern Ukraine, beginning in mid-April of 2014. And President Putin imagined that the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine would want to join with Russia. And he was completely shocked that this was not necessarily the case. And if you look at this map of the citizens of Ukraine in its eastern regions who opposed unification with Russia in April of 2014, you will see that President Putin's efforts to attract the Russian-speaking population of eastern Ukraine to Russia was not very successful. And it was not. And as a consequence of Russia's intervention in Ukraine, its political intervention, and then its military interventions, a low-intensity conflict broke out in Ukraine. A war broke out in Ukraine between the newly elected legitimate government of Ukraine and pro-Russian forces completely supported by Russia in eastern Ukraine. And despite various, and so as of March of 2015, when the final agreement, the second Minsk agreement occurred, in which Ukraine and Russia and Germany and France signed this agreement, creating a permanent ceasefire and a continuous form of negotiations regarding the political situation in eastern Ukraine, Russia occupied two major slivers of Ukrainian territory, the Crimea to the south, and a good parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts here in red in eastern Ukraine. And so this was the status. This has been the status of Ukraine since March of 2015, up to the outbreak of Russia's invasion in in February of 2022, in which Russia occupied about 7% of Ukrainian territory. And of course, the Ukrainians wanted these territories back. All of these territories, which Russia either annexed or claims to have under its military control, is not recognized by the international community as Russian. They are all recognized as legitimately belonging to Ukraine. And so a low-intensity hybrid war broke out in eastern Ukraine between pro-Ukrainian forces and those supported by Russia. This low-intensity war started up in February 2014, and it lasted until February of 2022, when Russia now invades on a larger scale than it did in 2014. All told, over the past 8 years, approximately 14,000 people have been killed, mostly military, but civilians as well. This war in the East has displaced somewhere between 1.5 to 1.8 million people, that is internally displaced people throughout Ukraine. The front lines kind of went on for about 280 miles, and there was really no resolution to this conflict. Every week, somewhere between 2 to 3, maybe 4 Ukrainian soldiers were killed by pro-Russian forces in the East, and this was a war, a low-intensity war, but it still was a war that continued for 8 years between the legitimate Ukrainian government on the one hand and the illegitimate kind of military and political formations in eastern Ukraine. So, what's happened up to 2014 is that the Orange and the Euromaidan revolution, the ideas of and the values of the Orange and the Euromaidan revolution prevailed in Ukraine. Ukraine has possessed 30 years of independence. All of its presidential elections have been deemed by international observers as free and fair. Ukraine experienced an imperfect pluralism, but a pluralism nevertheless. It nurtured a strong civil society, which, as you can see on your television screens on a daily basis, still exists and has even become stronger. And of course, in light of the fact that there's enormous amount of wealth inequality and enormous corruption in Ukraine, as is the case in most post-communist countries, these sectors of the civil society engaged in anti-corruption efforts constantly had to fight against corruption and sought to establish or to institutionalize the rule of law in Ukraine. And of course, all of these groups had a fierce determination to defend these values and these beliefs. Okay, so the first president, the first post-Euromaidan president, Petro Poroshenko, an oligarch who took the pro-democratic road, although many of his kind of actions in the past had been quite murky. Nevertheless, he was elected by 55% of all Ukrainians in 2014, and he began, pressured by these various kind of civil society groups in Ukraine, and with a reformist parliament elected in 2014, he began to introduce, and his parliament began to introduce a number of reforms.
Not much, yeah.
Excuse me? Oh, okay. And in terms of these reforms, they completely renewed or revised, reformed the Ukraine's armed forces, which had collapsed in the spring of 2014. Ukraine's armed forces in the spring of 2014 are not unlike what you see on the screens about the Russian military today and how it's very ineffective in Ukraine. It was very ineffective. Ukraine's military forces were very ineffective in 2014, and a number of reforms were put into place. And of course, many of these new military that Ukraine developed were developed under the guidance of NATO advisors as well as American advisors. Poroshenko's government also reformed various policing procedures in Ukraine. That is, the police in Ukraine were highly corrupt. I mean, you could buy a cop for pennies because, of course, the police were not paid very highly. And what happened after 2014 is that the local police now began to set professional standards. They hired new policemen and new policewomen, and the policing in Ukraine has become far more professional and far less corrupt than in the past. Poroshenko also introduced other anti-corruption measures, including a so-called e-procurement system, which reduced the corruption of the central government, in which all bids on government contracts had to go through a secure e-procurement system, in which the lowest bidder, depending on the qualifications of their company to do the job, got the contracts as opposed to money under the table. The Poroshenko government also reduced energy dependence on Russia, reformed the economy, decentralized the local government, introduced educational reform and raised it to European standards, introduced healthcare reforms, and started to improve Ukraine's aging structures. So Poroshenko, despite various rumors about him and his murky past, many of the things that he and his parliament introduced had a very positive effect, although of course all reforms like this do not kick in immediately. It took years down the road for them to develop, and they came to under full fruition under the new Zhelinski presidency. So by the end of 2019, there was a disillusionment with President Poroshenko. That is, a new presidential elections would be held in February of 2019. And Poroshenko's kind of polling favorability ratings were very small, were kind of not very high. It appeared as if he would not win the election in 2019. And the reasons for this were that many people felt that the war in the East had not come to an end, despite promises Poroshenko made when he ran for office in 2014. And of course, the war in the East was not necessarily Poroshenko's failure to bring the war in the East is not necessarily only his responsibility, but rather Mr. Putin's, who was kind of pumping the gas on the fire as much as he could under the circumstances. Most Ukrainians had experienced economic shock after Russia's occupation of the Crimea and the war in the Donbas area. Voters were tired of corruption and economic stagnation. And of course, all of this is really important. I mean, the issues of corruption and economic stagnation are very important in a country with the second lowest standard of living in Europe. And of course, it may be even lower than that of Moldova, which apparently is the lowest, the country with the lowest standard of living in Europe. Well, in the spring of 2019, presidential elections took place. The president in Ukraine serves a 5-year term. He or she needs to be reelected after 5 years by the entire voting population of Ukraine. And in the primary season, 18 candidates were whittled down to 2. And in the final presidential election on April 21st, 2019, 2 candidates kind of stood against each other. That is Volodymyr Zhelinski on the one hand and the incumbent president Poroshenko. So who is Zhelinski? Well, Zhelinski, and this is not a question just for Americans to have asked in 2019, even after his election, but rather many Ukrainians asked the same question in 2019. He was the youngest presidential candidate in Ukrainian history. He ran when he was 39 years old. He was trained as a lawyer, but he became a comedian and actor. He starred in this Russian language hit, kind of popular television series for 4 seasons. And it was called The Servant of the People, in which by accident, a history teacher in some obscure Ukrainian village is provoked by one of his students. And the student asks him, "What do you think about corruption in Ukraine?" And the teacher, acted by Zhelinski, the teacher goes on this like 10-minute rant about how everybody's corrupt. I mean, it's not unlike what most Alabama citizens, when they talk about politicians, how they speak. But of course, in terms of this 10-minute rant that this history teacher gave, he used all sorts of profanities, and he used all sorts of graphic language to express his total disgust with corruption in Ukraine. And of course, the student who egged the history teacher on videotaped this. and posted it on the internet. And the history teacher becomes very popular, and he is drafted to run for political office, and he becomes the president of Ukraine. And the entire television series is about the efforts of this history teacher as president to deal with corruption in Ukraine. And Zelensky, as you can see, is very young, handsome, enthusiastic. And of course, this television series brought him great fame, not just in Ukraine, but across the entire Russian-speaking world, in Russia, as well as all kind of other kind of where Russian media is available. And as a consequence, he had enormous name recognition. Although he was not a seasoned he was never a politician. He had never run for office before, not even dog catcher. But because everyone knew who he was, he became kind of the protest candidate. And initially, the voters in Ukraine did not imagine him as anything more than a protest candidate. He used social media in terms of his campaign. He never had a press conference during the presidential campaign, but he did publicize his program on the media, in social media. And there were three simple points: to bring the war to the east to an end, to eliminate the stranglehold of the oligarchs in Ukraine, which were strangling the economy and democracy, and to end corruption in Ukraine. So three very simple, very kind of idealistic points. And so in the election of April the 21st, 2021, Zelensky won by a landslide, 73% of the vote, from all across Ukraine in all of these areas that you can see in green. The ones in gray could not vote because they were under Russian occupation. Only kind of one region of Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, voted, Zelensky did not win a majority of the vote. So this was an outstanding achievement by an amateur, complete political amateur. Shortly after he becomes president of Ukraine, he creates a new political party called the Servant of the People Political Party. It won 60% of the vote to the Ukrainian parliament. So essentially, Zelensky has won 73% of the vote, and his political party has won a majority in parliament. So he's in this very enviable situation in which no Ukrainian president before him had been. That is, having won popular support, and his political party is in charge. Of course, there was a problem with there was a problem with Zelensky's political party. That is, many of the young men and women who joined this political party in 2019 also did not have political experience. They were real amateurs. So essentially what you had is an amateur politician as president and an amateur political party in charge. And of course, the political party, as well as President Zelensky, lost their kind of geezer popularity of 2019. That is, there was a global pandemic which affected Ukraine, and the Servant of the People political party were not very well coordinated, and it was not really a political party, but a group of people who had won office because they had kind of ridden on Zhelinski's coattails. And so so Zhelinski's majority in parliament was totally not very effective. Nevertheless, and of course, there was these increasing suspicions that Zhelinski himself was an agent of at least one oligarch in Ukraine, if not more. Because, of course, and Zhelinski did have a connection with one, a very close one, and everyone was watching whether Zhelinski would break with him, the oligarch, or not. Okay, so that kind of sets up what happens after 2019, and let's move to 2022. In February, President Putin decides to invade Ukraine with approximately 200,000 troops, not enough to conquer the entire territory of Ukraine, which is 233,000 square miles. That would be less than one Russian soldier per square kilometer or square mile of Ukraine. This is not a way to occupy a country. Of course, what Mr. Putin imagined would be that once the Russians invaded, that the Ukrainian government would completely collapse and that President Zhelinski would cry uncle. But the Ukrainian government did not collapse. A popular resistance, a people's war, has emerged, as you can see from your screens on a daily basis. The unprofessional Russian military got bogged down and began a very brutal war of attrition, in which Russian military commanders began to target civilian centers, especially schools, hospitals, and apartment complexes. So what I'd like to bring to your attention is why do the Ukrainians resist? Well, before the invasion, before 2022, Ukraine has had this experience of 30 years of independence, in which, as I mentioned, the primary features of this independence was that there was no one complete political figure in charge in the way that Putin became in charge in Russia. That there were various civil society values were embraced. That civil society was quite large and quite mobilized, far larger and far more mobilized than any other post-Soviet country, except perhaps for the Baltic states. Various military changes and economic reforms took place after the Euromaidan revolution of 2014. And of course, there's this memory of the war in eastern Ukraine, in which Crimea and parts of the Donbas area of eastern Ukraine have been militarily occupied, and Crimea itself annexed by Russia since 2014. So this is why Ukrainians kind of had this history of resistance before the invasion. But after the invasion, what was most surprising to many people, including to Pentagon advisors, Pentagon generals who had actually advised the Ukrainian military after 2014, was that it wasn't just that the military resisted, but the Ukrainian population as a whole. And of course, this is all kind of focused on President Zhelinski. President Zelensky could have fled Ukraine after the Russian invasion in February, as did the president of Afghanistan last August. But President Zelensky stayed and has become a very effective public relations, the head public relations officer for Ukraine, appearing at all sorts of international, before various international organizations such as the United Nations yesterday. But Zelensky, and here's a picture of him, and this is a picture of him from Monday, when he visited the town of Bucha, where the Russian military has executed close to over 300 civilians. But it's not just a question of President Zelensky. Leadership, of course, is not just one man barking orders or one woman barking orders, but rather it is affirming what most people want to hear. And the mark of a great leader is to figure out what the people want and to kind of mold this opinion in a certain direction. And so what President Zelensky has done, he's essentially rallied the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainian people have rallied him. I mean, it's kind of an interactive process. It's not one man is doing this, but rather it is kind of an interactive effort by both the president and the parliament, as well as the people as a whole. And so what President Zelensky has done, he's kind of rallied the Ukrainian people to resist. I mean, he, although his wealth is never on the level of the oligarchs in Ukraine, he too could have fled, but he stayed. And he's committed himself to defending Ukraine, even if it will be at the cost of his own life or that of his family. Well, another thing, that has kind of rallied Ukrainian resistance, especially since the Russian invasion, are the various massacres that you've seen on television. Of course, they don't show you the whole thing, but here are a few photos taken by the New York Times from yesterday's edition about the civilian deaths in Bucha. Here in this one, 3 dead civilians in a garden. Here, you may have seen this scene from a month ago in which a pregnant woman was evacuated from a maternity hospital which received Russian shellings in the city of Mariupol. And in March of 2022, and after a month, she and her unborn child died. And this kind of picture of a destroyed school in Kharkiv from February 2022. I mean, these images of the war and the destruction of not just physical property, but humans as well, has affected Ukrainians and made them even more determined to resist. Before I get to that, so kind of to sum up, because I'm coming to the end of my assigned time, and I would like to hear your questions. To sum up, in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Putin has committed one of the cardinal sins of political change, of seeking to occupy a country. And that is, he's violated the principles of Machiavelli. Everyone imagines President Putin to be kind of a rational kind of a person, a so-called realist who takes advantage of the opportunities that have come his way. But as Machiavelli points out, he asks this question, a very famous question in The Prince, published over 500 years ago, or nearly 500 years ago. Is it better to be loved, or is it better to be feared? That is it better for a prince to be loved or to be feared? And Machiavelli answers this question. And despite the fact that everyone imagines that Machiavelli is kind of the devil incarnate, I mean, essentially he was, in many respects, the Ann Landers of his time, dealing with military and political matters. That is, he got to the heart of it. And as Ann Landers used to say, wake up and smell the coffee. But Machiavelli said, in answering this question, is it better to be loved or feared? It is better to be loved than feared, or is it better to be loved or than feared, or feared than loved? It must be answered that a good prince should wish to be both. But because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved. Okay, everybody, yeah, that's a good point. However, Machiavelli goes on, and this is not really cited too much. The prince, however, should inspire fear in such a way that if he does not win love, he avoids hatred. And for Machiavelli, hatred is a very different emotion than fear. Fear has a large element of rationality to it. Hatred does not. And the reason that Machiavelli gives may sound sexist, but if one looks beyond the sexism, he makes a very important point. That is, the prince should avoid hatred because he can endure vehemence while being feared, but not hated. And he would be hated, Machiavelli points out, as long as he abstains from taking over the property of his citizens and subjects and from violating their women, that is, their families. So this is Machiavelli's point. His point is that a good prince must endeavor to avoid hatred. And if there's one thing that Putin has done in Ukraine over the past 6 weeks, he's essentially stoked the flames of hatred against them, which makes the Ukrainian resistance nearly, far fiercer than the Russian military that Putin has sent after the Ukrainians. Okay, so the basic question in this conflict, this war, the real question that comes down to a very simple one. Does Ukraine belong to Russia, or is Ukraine an independent country? Putin believes that he and his control over Russia are experiencing an existential threat from an independent, Western-oriented Ukraine. Putin claims that Russia and Ukraine are one and indivisible. And Ukrainians believe at this point, in light of all of these atrocities, that Putin's Russia represents an existential threat to Ukraine and to all citizens of Ukraine. And they want to leave the Russian orbit and to kind of get themselves decolonized from Russia. As you might imagine by now, these are two very non-negotiable positions. And so, as a consequence, a bloody war an apocalypse has now plagued Ukraine. So where does this war end? Even if Putin wins, Ukrainians will resist passively, if not actively. If Putin wins, there will be an enormous refugee crisis inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And of course, there's the whole question about the future of these refugees, especially women and children, and the issue of sex trafficking in the West. And of course, this war has lit the fire of inflation. There will be higher prices in oil, natural gas, and food, not just in the United States and in Europe, but in many less developed countries as well. So I'm sorry, I do not have kind of a positive ending to this story. I'm waiting for the story to develop. So I can't say that I bring you good news. All I can tell you, it's going to get far worse than it is at this point in time. Thank you. If you want to take a break for 5 minutes, we can take a break, and then I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
What is the position of the Russian population in eastern Ukraine since the invasion?
Okay. What's the position of them? They don't want the Russian army there. They want Putin to go home. And you can see that. You can see that on your daily television screens. That is, as you watch kind of some of these people in eastern Ukraine who stand up to the Russian army, these 80-year-old grandmothers who swear at Russian troops, they're swearing in Russian. They're Russian speakers. And they are totally opposed to this invasion. They want the Russians to leave.
George,
Yes.
why is it? It seems to me that NATO and the United States have been stuck in a way by Putin's comments about nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. He doesn't have to do anything, but it has certainly limited the response of the EU, the NATO, and the US to providing Ukraine what it needs. And that doesn't bode well in the long term.
Yes, but that's a good point. However, I think the realization in Washington as well as in NATO is now increasingly that this war is not going to end soon. Yesterday, I heard an interview with General Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. military, in which and I would like to read his entire statement. I only saw kind of the soundbite on television, but he proclaimed that this is going to be a war. The war in Ukraine is going to be a protracted one, which may continue for years. And so the question then becomes, and shortly after that, or as General Milley gave this statement, the Pentagon announced an even more amount of military equipment going to Ukraine. So I think the question that most military leaders in the United States, and political leaders, because of course in the United States, political leaders can overrule the military ones, is what happens if this becomes a protracted war? And how much more support will we give Ukraine? Despite Putin's nuclear saber rattling. So I think, as I see this, and I'm not a military expert, it seems to me that the United States is also slowly, and NATO is slowly raising the resistance level in Ukraine by providing more arms and more sophisticated arms than before.
Dr. Liber, could I ask you a question, please, about I was surprised to hear at the outset of this war, my family in South Africa informed me that one of the local charities in Durban, South Africa, had actually evacuated 200 Ukrainian orphans to Romania.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, I was surprised because they've got enough poverty in Africa to go around. But anyway, it turns out that because of the poverty in Ukraine, the South Africans support some of the institutions, especially orphanages. Apparently, there's large numbers of destitute people in orphanages, and there's such a disconnect between the resources of the Ukraine, the natural resources, the agriculture, and the poverty. And I wanted to ask you to comment on that.
I'm sorry, comment on what?
The disconnect between the poverty and the resources.
Right. This is because in terms of when communism collapsed in 1991, there was a scramble to take over the natural resources of Ukraine as well as other areas in Russia as well, in which, in this kind of free-for-all economic situation, the so-called oligarchs emerged. I mean, the wealth inequality in Ukraine and Russia is far worse than the wealth inequality in the United States. And of course, as these men, predominantly men, stole money from the state budget, they did not feel that it was incumbent on them to become like Bill Gates, or to kind of give back to the community. And so you have an enormous kind of wealth inequality in Ukraine, as well as many of these other post-communist countries. And this is because what happens is once communism collapsed, new economic laws, or a new economic system, a so-called neoliberal system, was introduced, which abandoned the whole notion of social welfare. And so older people, say, in Ukraine, I mean, their pensions are really kind of below the poverty level. You're right to point out the whole issue of orphanage or orphans in Ukraine. I believe Ukraine has the largest number of orphans in kind of the post-communist world because of the poverty. Many parents of these orphans are still alive. It's just that they are too poor to feed their children, so they put them in orphanages. And so as many orphans who can be evacuated is a good deal for them, because it may provide them with better opportunities than they would have received in Ukraine or elsewhere. So it's all comes down to kind of the wealth inequality which emerges in these post-communist countries after 1991.
Thank you.
Dr. Liber.
Yes.
The influence of China is going to be, in my opinion, the most important factor in the ending of the war. When China sees that its large economic interests are threatened by the war, then they will maybe withdraw their support for Putin, and that will enable him to cause him to leave the Ukraine. Do you see any possibility of that?
Unfortunately, I'm not a specialist on Chinese politics, so I can't really say. However, and in terms of China being active in this, China has become one of the largest investors in Ukraine. So many of the things which are being destroyed in Ukraine have been built by the Chinese. However, the Chinese, are not just an economic power, but China is also a political power and a military power. China is also, like the Russian Federation, interested in tipping the world in their favor. But of course, China is far more powerful economically, and if not militarily, probably not militarily, but far more economically powerful than Russia. China can help. China can stop this by refusing to buy Russian oil and natural gas, but it's kind of unclear whether it would do so. But China also may have another interest, and that is swallowing Russia, because essentially of the two, Russia and China, Russia is weaker. China is a powerful country, and in terms of whatever deal that the Chinese and the Russian leaders have established, China can take advantage of the situation and become far more powerful over Russia than Russia really wants. So I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. All I can say is you're right that China is very important in this equation, and the United States and NATO countries should, and the European Union should make every effort to bring China on board in sanctioning Russia, because essentially Russia can now avoid the worst sanctions that the Europeans and the Americans impose by working closely with the Chinese.
What is your feeling about the Russian population's feeling about the war?
Which Russian? In Russia, you mean?
Yes.
Good question. It's always difficult to do polling in kind of an authoritarian society, because increasingly people like to answer the politically correct question as opposed to the politically incorrect one, even to pollsters. However, the recent polls that have come out of Russia indicate that President Putin's support has increased over the past month after the invasion. This war is popular for Russians primarily because they see for most Russians, they see a very sanitized version of this war on their television screens. The media, the mass media in Russia is controlled by Putin's government. They only show one kind of side of the story, and most Russians believe that they're winning at this point.
Excuse me. Dr. Liber, can the Russian economy sustain a protracted conflict in Ukraine? I've read that the gross national product of Russia is probably about that of Italy, 10th or 11th among the industrialized countries. Europe is moving to cut back on imports of oil and natural gas, which are their primary sources of income, and may leave the Russians with no market for their oil and gas other than perhaps India and China. If the NATO countries continue supplying aid and necessary arms and ammunition to the Ukrainians, can the Soviet Union sustain the cost of this?
That's kind of a big question. And I mean, that's the 64,000 ruble question. And frankly, I'm not sure. However, if, as you point out, Russia persuades China and India to buy their oil and natural gas, then Russia is far less affected than the West imagined. So
Meaning that if you only have two purchases of your product, that they have a tremendous bargaining position vis-a-vis you.
you mean what, China and India, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, they do. I mean, they can, they can bargain stuff down because, of course, Russia doesn't have, much of an outside market. But of course, at this point, Russian natural gas is still going to Europe. Not all European countries or Europe, not all European Union countries or NATO countries want to boycott Russian natural gas and oil. They have how do I call it, an incestuous relationship with Russian oil. And instead of kind of getting off of fossil fuels, many Europeans have become even more addicted to Russian oil and natural gas over the past decade or so. So it becomes, I guess, a point by which the United States needs to convince even its own European allies to go full throttle with the boycott of Russian energy sources for Europeans.
I'd like to, I think it's 11:30, and I think it's probably about time to end the session. I would like to thank Dr. Liber for his insights, which have been most helpful. And I think we should end it at this point. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you very
Liber.
much.
Very much.
Thank you.
All right,
Very
thank you.
good. Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Very-
you.